Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight we're traveling back to the Middle Ages, a time of castles, knights, plagues, and peasants. We often imagine this era as dark, dirty, and brutal, and in many ways, it was. But hidden beneath the wars and famines was a deep well of survival knowledge, techniques, and traditions that ordinary people relied on for centuries to endure a world far harsher than our own. Today, much of that knowledge has been lost or ignored. We live in a time of electricity, supermarkets, and modern medicine, where survival feels almost effortless. But in the medieval world, survival was never guaranteed. Every winter was a test, every harvest a gamble, every illness a roll of the dice. And yet, people endured not through luck alone, but through skills we've all but forgotten. For peasants, survival began with the land. They knew how to coax food from poor soil, how to preserve harvests through long winters, how to forage for herbs and roots when famine struck. They built homes from earth, wood, and stone, heated them with peat or charcoal, and fashioned tools from whatever materials lay close at hand. What we might call primitive today was, in fact, a remarkable mastery of adaptation. But survival wasn't only about food and shelter, it was also about community. Villagers bound themselves together through shared labor, planting, harvesting, repairing, defending. Alone, a person might starve; together they could endure. Medieval people also trusted in traditions, rituals, and beliefs that gave meaning to hardship and helped them face uncertainty with resilience. When we look back now, it's tempting to see the medieval world only in terms of its brutality. But if we peel back the layers, we find lessons that still matter. These forgotten survival techniques remind us that our ancestors were not helpless victims of their age; they were problem solvers, innovators, and survivors in ways we've nearly forgotten. So tonight, let's rediscover what they knew, because who knows? One day, their skills might be the ones we need again. For medieval people, survival started with the soil beneath their feet. Farming was not just a way of life, it was the difference between life and death. Every seed planted carried the weight of an entire household's survival. And every harvest was a gamble against weather, pests, and fate. Peasants tilled the land with simple tools: plows drawn by oxen, hoes fashioned from iron, and wooden rakes that wore smooth with years of use. The soil was rarely generous, and fields often had to rest in rotation to recover. This led to the rise of the three-field system, a clever method where one field grew grain, another legumes, and the third was left fallow. It may sound simple, but it helped prevent soil exhaustion and gave peasants a steadier food supply. Harvest time was backbreaking, but the real challenge came afterward: preserving enough food to last through the long winter. Without refrigerators, medieval people relied on methods that demanded both skill and foresight. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried until it hardened into something closer to jerky than a fresh cut. Vegetables were pickled in brine or stored in root cellars dug deep into the earth, where the temperature stayed cool and stable. Grain was carefully threshed and stored in granaries, safe from rats and damp, to be milled into flour throughout the year. Bread, in fact, was the foundation of medieval survival. A bad grain harvest meant hunger across entire regions, and famine could spread like wildfire. To stretch supplies, peasants often mixed wheat with barley, rye, or even ground up acorns, producing loaves that were coarse but filling. Porridges and stews made from whatever could be gathered. Beans, cabbage, turnips, onions were staples of the medieval table. Yet food storage wasn't just about practicality, it was about foresight and discipline. A family that feasted too freely after harvest might find themselves starving by February. Survival demanded restraint, patience, and a communal sense of responsibility. What may look to us like hardship was, for them, a kind of wisdom. By learning how to preserve the gifts of the land, they stretched every harvest into hope for the future. And in that careful balance between feast and famine, the medieval village endured. In the medieval world, survival didn't stop at the harvest. Once food was secured, the next challenge was shelter. A home wasn't just four walls and a roof, it was the fragile barrier between a family and the biting cold of winter, the damp of autumn rains, and the ever-present dangers of disease and fire. For peasants, homes were humble but ingeniously practical. Most were built from the materials at hand: wattle and daub walls woven from sticks and packed with clay, straw, and mud, thatched roofs tied tightly enough to shed rain, and timber frames cut from nearby forests. Floors were often simple earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw to soften the ground and soak up spills. Heat was precious. Fireplaces, as we know them, were rare in peasant homes. Instead, a simple hearth burned in the center of the single-room house, its smoke curling upward through a hole in the roof or drifting out cracks in the thatch. Families huddled close around the fire, not only for warmth but for cooking and light. Fuel varied depending on the region: wood in forests, peat in marshlands, or dried animal dung where trees were scarce. Insulation was almost non-existent by modern standards. Winters were endured beneath layers of wool, cloaks, and furs. At night, families often slept together in shared beds or clustered on straw pallets for warmth. Animals, too, were sometimes sheltered in the same building: cows, goats, or pigs, adding both body heat and the constant reminder that survival meant living close to the land. But these homes weren't merely shelters from the elements, they were also defenses against hunger and uncertainty. Loft spaces stored grain and dried foods. Strong doors barred thieves and wild animals. Walls, though thin, defined the heart of family and community. Even the smallest cottages represented resilience. Built with simple tools and maintained by constant repair, they were proof that survival didn't demand grandeur, only ingenuity and persistence. In those smoky, crowded, humble homes, medieval families found enough warmth to endure the coldest nights. In the medieval world, sickness was never far away. Plagues, fevers, infections, these were constant threats in a time before antibiotics, vaccines, or even the idea of germs. If you were sick, the nearest thing to a doctor was either a monk with a herbal manuscript, a village healer with knowledge passed down through generations, or sometimes, just your grandmother with a cabbage leaf and a prayer. Herbs were the heart of medieval healing. Every village had its wise woman or herbalist who knew which plants soothed pain, which closed wounds, and which might just kill you if brewed too strong. Chamomile was steeped into calming teas. Sage was rubbed on sore throats. Garlic, pungent and powerful, was a natural antibiotic long before we had the word. And honey, golden and sticky, wasn't just for sweetening porridge, it was medicine, dressing wounds and keeping infection at bay with its natural antibacterial properties. But remedies weren't always gentle. Some were harsh, born of desperation. Poultices of onions and vinegar were pressed against buboes during plague outbreaks, a treatment that rarely worked but at least gave the sense of doing something. Leeches were applied to balance the humors, draining blood to release imagined poisons. Strong-smelling herbs like rosemary, wormwood, or lavender were carried in pouches and masks to ward off bad air believed to cause disease. Healing also blended with ritual. Cures often came with prayers, charms, or even astrological timing. A wound might be bound with a whispered blessing, or a sick child passed through the smoke of burning herbs as both medicine and protection. Faith was not separate from healing, it was woven into every remedy. Of course, survival wasn't about defeating every illness. More often, it was about relief, resilience, and hope. Even cabbage leaves were pressed onto swollen joints or wrapped around wounds as cooling compresses. It sounds simple to us, but for medieval people, that green, leafy bandage was a lifeline. Looking back, it's easy to dismiss these remedies as superstition. Yet modern science confirms that many herbs they relied on, like willow bark for pain, mint for digestion, and yarrow for clotting, do indeed work. Their knowledge was not random, it was centuries of trial, error, and survival distilled into everyday practice. So, while we might laugh at the thought of someone treating a fever with garlic wine or chanting over a sprig of rosemary, remember this: those remedies helped entire generations endure, and in their own smoky cottages and monastery gardens, medieval healers were keeping the fragile flame of life alive. Survival in the Middle Ages wasn't only about food, shelter, or medicine, it was also about staying safe. Famine and disease were deadly enough, but danger also came on two legs: thieves, raiders, and the occasional band of desperate wanderers who saw your grain sack as their salvation. Without cameras, alarms, or guard dogs trained with treats, medieval people had to get creative. One of the simplest, yet most effective solutions was the living fence. Instead of wasting timber on fragile wooden palisades, farmers planted rows of hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn trees close together, weaving and bending their branches into thick, spiked walls. Over time, these hedgerows grew denser and more impenetrable, forming barriers that kept livestock in, strangers out, and thieves very unhappy. Unlike wooden fences, which rotted and collapsed, living fences grew stronger with every season. They were security systems powered by sunlight. Villagers also relied on natural defenses. Homes and barns were often clustered on higher ground, surrounded by ditches filled with water or sharpened stakes. Paths into a settlement could be narrowed intentionally, forcing visitors through choke points where watchful eyes or arrows could keep them in check. Even the placement of fields mattered. Farmland on the outskirts was often riskier, while essential stores were kept closer to the heart of the community. But not all defense was about brute force, it was also about deterrence. Hanging smoked meat high in rafters, hiding valuables in hollow trees, or even burying butter deep in peat bogs served not only to preserve food, but to keep it out of greedy hands. A thief couldn't steal what he couldn't find. For larger threats, like bandits or raiders, cooperation was survival. Villagers worked together to build watchtowers, sometimes nothing more than a raised platform, or rang church bells as alarms when danger approached. The sound carried across fields and forests, calling every able hand to defend the village. Sometimes even the local animals played a role. Geese, for example, made excellent guard dogs, honking loudly at the approach of strangers. Yet the most powerful medieval defense was community itself. Alone, a peasant family was vulnerable. But together, working the fields, weaving the hedges, sharing food, keeping watch, they formed a web of protection as resilient as any wall. Survival wasn't about building castles of stone. It was about building castles of trust. What may look to us like primitive defenses were, for them, ingenious. With no electricity, no steel locks, and no police to call, they used nature, craft, and cooperation to keep their families safe. And in that quiet, stubborn way, they defended their world against both hunger and fear. For us, darkness is just the flick of a switch away. But in the medieval world, night was a force of its own, vast, smothering and filled with danger, both real and imagined. Without fire or light, life stopped at sundown, work ended, travel became perilous, and every shadow seemed to breathe with the unknown. To survive the night, medieval people had to master one thing above all: fire. Fire was everything. It cooked meals, dried clothes, warmed homes, scared away predators, and gave families a center to gather around. But making fire wasn't easy. Striking flint and steel was slow, especially in damp weather. That's why people often carried portable fire bundles, glowing embers wrapped in moss, bark, or fungus, tucked safely into leather pouches or hollowed horns. With just a puff of breath, a dying ember could be coaxed back to life, sparing the misery of starting from scratch in the freezing dark. Inside cottages, the hearth was the heart of survival. Smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, filling the air with the sharp scent of burning wood, peat, or dung. Flames flickered against watterland or walls, casting long shadows that were both comforting and eerie. Families gathered close, telling stories, mending clothes, or simply sitting in silence, letting the glow push back the night. But fire wasn't only for warmth, it was also for light. Candles were expensive, often made from beeswax reserved for churches or the wealthy. Ordinary people relied on cheaper solutions like rushlights, marsh reeds soaked in animal fat, propped upright to burn with a greasy, sputtering flame. They smoked, smelled of bacon, and lasted barely half an hour, but they worked. A rushlight was not elegance, it was survival. Some households built stone shelves and cool corners away from the fire to store food, while keeping the living space lit with smoldering embers. Others stretched every spark of fuel, banking fires beneath ash so that coals would last until morning. To let the fire go out entirely was a serious mistake, one that could mean hours of shivering labor just to bring the hearth back to life. And fire wasn't just practical, it was psychological. In a world haunted by wolves, raiders, and disease, a steady flame offered reassurance. It was a fragile but stubborn symbol of control, of life refusing to be swallowed by darkness. To medieval people, fire was more than a tool, it was a companion. It flickered with them through storms, whispered against the silence of endless winters, and lit their path in a world where night could so easily conquer the unprepared. If food is scarce today, most of us head to the supermarket. In the medieval world, there was no such safety net. A failed harvest didn't just mean tighter budgets, it meant hunger, desperation, and sometimes death. Yet famine wasn't rare. It was a recurring part of life, and when cupboards emptied, medieval people turned to the land itself, finding ways to survive on what little nature provided. One of the most infamous famine foods was bark bread. No, not the crunchy crust, you're imagining actual tree bark. Peasants stripped the inner layer of birch, pine, or elm trees, dried it, ground it into a coarse flour, and mixed it with whatever scraps of grain they had left. The result was a dense, chewy loaf that tasted like forest floor, but it kept people alive when the alternative was starvation. Acorns were another lifeline. Bitter and tannic in their raw form, they had to be soaked or boiled to remove toxins before being ground into meal. Once prepared, they could be baked into flatbreads or thickened into porridge. Not exactly a feast, but filling enough to stave off hunger in lean winters. Foraging also played a crucial role. Families gathered nettles, dandelion greens, wild garlic, and mushrooms, though the wrong mushroom could be a death sentence. Roots like burdock and turnip were dug from frozen soil, while berries and nuts, carefully dried and stored, became treasures when fresh food was gone. Even animals became emergency meals. Peasants sometimes trapped small birds, rabbits, or even hedgehogs, which were roasted inside a layer of clay. When the clay was cracked open, the spines came off with it, leaving edible meat inside, a trick born of necessity, not culinary flair. But famine food wasn't only about survival of the body, it was about survival of the spirit. Villagers shared what they had, stretching meals with watery stews and endless porridge, eating together not only to fill their stomachs, but to keep despair at bay. Stories, prayers, and rituals accompanied these meager meals, transforming bitter bark and tough roots into symbols of endurance. To us, chewing bark bread or grinding acorns might sound desperate, even absurd, but for medieval families staring down a barren winter, these rough meals were lifelines. Each bite was a reminder. Survival often demanded swallowing pride, along with whatever the earth reluctantly offered. When we think of survival, we often picture tools, weapons, or food, but in the medieval world, some of the most powerful survival strategies were invisible, woven into the fabric of community and belief. Alone, a peasant might struggle. Together, a village could endure. Medieval life was built around shared labor, harvesting, planting, repairing homes. These tasks were rarely done in isolation. Families worked side by side, trading time and effort rather than coins. If a barn collapsed, neighbors gathered to rebuild it. If a family fell ill, others helped with the fields. Survival wasn't just individual, it was collective. This sense of cooperation extended into feasts and fasts. After a harvest, villagers celebrated with communal meals, reinforcing bonds and reminding everyone that abundance was best enjoyed together. During scarcity, fasting wasn't just religious, it was practical discipline, teaching restraint so that food would last through the winter. Faith itself was survival. The church bells didn't just call to prayer, they marked time, gave order to the chaos of seasons, and offered comfort during famine, plague, and war. Rituals like blessings of fields, processions, or lighting candles for the sick gave people hope when medicine or luck failed. Even small gestures mattered. Amulets, charms, or herbs tied above a door gave families a sense of protection. Pilgrimages, though dangerous, offered spiritual renewal and sometimes even material aid, as communities supported travelers on their journey. And, perhaps most importantly, belief gave meaning to suffering. Hardship wasn't seen as random cruelty, it was a test, a trial, or even a path toward salvation. This perspective didn't erase pain, but it gave people the strength to keep moving, to keep enduring, when despair could have easily won. In the medieval world, survival was not just about mastering the land, it was about mastering despair. Tools, food, and fire mattered, but what kept villagers alive through centuries of famine, plague, and invasion was something less tangible: the unshakable power of community, ritual, and faith. They endured because they endured together. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it's tempting to see only the struggle, famine, disease, hardship, but beneath the smoke-filled cottages, the bark bread, the smoky rafters, and the whispered prayers, there was something profound: resilience. Survival wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance, creativity, and community. People turned bark into bread, moss into fire, herbs into medicine, and neighbors into family. They lived with less, yet often understood more about interdependence, patience, and the rhythms of the earth than we do today. We live now in an age of abundance and convenient supermarkets that never close, lights that banish the night, medicine that works in hours. And yet, our ancestors might still have something to teach us: that survival isn't found in luxury, but in adaptability. Not in solitude, but in solidarity. Not in ease, but in meaning. Their forgotten techniques are more than curiosities. They are reminders of what it means to be human in the face of uncertainty. To plant, to build, to heal, to share, to believe. That was survival then, and perhaps it still is now. So the real question is this: if tomorrow all our conveniences disappeared, would we remember how to endure? Have we forgotten too much?